Welcome to the webinar Exploring Soils in the Garden. My name is Stephanie Bugash, and I am the Outreach Specialist for the Wisconsin School Garden Network. I'll be moderating the webinar today. We love this to be an interactive kind of conversation, so if people have questions, please go ahead and use the chat function that should be located on your control panel to give questions, make comments. We will be doing a Q&A session at the end, so please feel free during the call to use that chat box. If you cannot hear us or you have technical difficulties, please also use that chat box. This webinar is being recorded right now, and we'll be sharing out a link. So if you have to leave early or have to come in and out, or you want to share it with some of your colleagues and network, we'll be sending it out after the webinar. So first, a little bit about the Wisconsin School Garden Network. We originally started in April 2016, and we are a network of schools, early care and education sites, after-school programming, and other youth garden organizations across the state. Our mission is to improve the health of children and well-being by supporting and promoting best practices in garden education. Basically, what that means on the ground is that we're connecting educators and hopefully sharing out the things that we've learned through the network that we've built. Next. This Wisconsin School Garden Network is a project of Community Groundworks in Madison, as well as one of our supporters is in the Environmental Design Lab, and we are funded by the Wisconsin Partnership Program through the University of School of Medicine and Public Health. Kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty of, so we support health and we support school garden education, but what we actually do, what that looks like to everyone is we provide trainings and workshops and webinars, such as this one. We go around to different sites in Wisconsin and give physical workshops. We also develop resources and distribute those resources. We have many different books and different briefs on our website. We also have a newsletter that comes out once a month, and you can sign up for that if you'd like on our website. We also are a place to share stories. So as we continue to build our network, we hear about different garden programs that are happening, and we share those success stories around the state, hopefully to be inspiring and to give other people ideas. We also can offer technical assistance. So if you have, no worries, if you have questions about the garden, about programming, any sorts of things like that, we can offer that technical assistance by giving us a call or email or even in person. Next up, resources. I just want to highlight, this is our homepage. Clicking on the resources button there, you can find that's highlighted in teal. You can find a link to our searchable library. This is a place that has over, I think there are hundreds of different resources around youth garden education. We also, in the same tab, if you click down, there is a funding opportunity button as well. Right now, there are tons of grants out there supporting youth gardening education, ones to get started, ones to expand gardens. So I encourage you to check out that page because there are a lot of grants out there right now, and as people start to continue to build their garden programs. Next. Lastly, one thing I wanted to share is our map. We are working to map all of the youth gardens, school gardens in the state of Wisconsin. Right now, we currently have over 600 gardens on our map. These are gardens, like I mentioned, at ECE sites, community centers, elementary school, middle school, high schools, Boys and Girls Clubs, YMCAs. And so we're really trying to work, this network this map is an opportunity to network with folks, to see who has a garden around you, and to make connections across those gardens. So if you have a youth garden program in Wisconsin, we'd love to have you on our map if you aren't already, and you can do that by going to our website. Next slide. All right, without further ado, I'd love to hand it over to Professor Veronica, who's going to lead this webinar, Exploring Soils in the Garden.
Awesome, thanks, Stephanie. So I'm very happy that I get to speak on behalf of Wisconsin School Garden Network on some activities that I have been thinking about as we think about how we can explore soils in the garden. And I primarily teach classes that are related to plant science at the University of Wisconsin River Falls, but I've been especially interested, as many other agronomists are, in how the health of the soil, the quality of the soil, the physical properties of the soil impact our ability to grow plants. And so it's helped me think about how we can help engage children in thinking about the soils beneath their feet every time they go into a garden or some other, maybe recreational or educational session. So I've tried to divide this webinar into some different activities that maybe can be done in a garden or on recreational turf or some other kind of setting that maybe would be accessible for a school or a nonprofit organization. Some of these tests can be very, very advanced. I'm trying to present them at a level that would be applicable to a younger audience, but some of these activities really are geared for, sometimes even professionals in the field if you have the right equipment. So they're kind of universal tests in some ways that we're going to be talking about, or universal activities. So when we think about soil, we like to just, in our area of study, to really emphasize that using the word dirt to describe soil is not really appropriate, because soil is so much more than just particles that we're trying to maybe do away with, and that soils have very special properties that are unique to a geography, that are very important for how we're going to grow plants, very important for how systems are going to cycle in the environment. And so I always love these stickers that are put out by the the Soil Science Society of America. And if you are an educator, you can go to the Soil Science Society of America website and actually request to have some of these stickers that I think they have in maybe 16 different languages or something like that. So it's really something that we're trying to promote from our professional society level, to really be calling that matter below our feet soil and not dirt, because it's just so much more than that. So when we think about soil, right, really the big thing is that using the term dirt is sometimes conceived in some negative ways, because it's kind of the stuff that gets on our fingernails or on our clothes. And as I mentioned, soil is just so much more than that. A soil is something that is really a living factory. And what I mean by that as a living factory is that it really is a system that supports many types of organisms. So both macroscopic organisms, insects and earthworms, and even microscopic organisms like fungi and bacteria, and many of these important organisms that are too small for us to really view with our naked eye. And how soil provides that as a living factory is by providing food to these organisms, by providing water or moisture for these organisms to survive, and by providing a habitat for these organisms to live in. And so the way that we treat our soils really can impact all of those things, and therefore the life that's basically below our feet. And so we'll talk about on the next slide about some of the things that we do to soil that might influence what we call kind of soil health properties. And soil health is a really broad term that's used a lot in the professional societies of crop science and soil science right now. But really it's a term to help us think about all of the encompassing properties of soil that allow it to provide the benefits to the organisms that live in it, as well as us organisms that utilize it to fulfill our daily lives. So things that we do to our soil that can influence its healthiness or its properties include how we disturb it, so how we maybe till it, or how we open up the soil for different needs, chemicals that we can provide or apply to the soil for different reasons. So I really think about agriculture a lot, so I think a lot about the different types of pesticides or fertilizers that get applied to soils and how that impacts its health. But also just moving over soil. And what we'll talk about in a few slides is that you can get different types of soil samples based on where certain areas, maybe of your schoolyard, are being ran over a lot. So a playground soil is going to be quite different than a soil that's maybe near a fence line or maybe in an unused part of your yard. And that can really show to students how we treat the soil is going to affect what's happening below our feet in terms of this idea of traffic, or how much we move over the soil. The other thing that impacts the health of a soil is plant diversity. And this is where the garden can come in as well, is as we're growing different vegetables or fruits, or if you in your garden you use something called a cover crop, or a crop that's used to cover the soil over time when you're not growing your main vegetables or fruits, all that plant biodiversity helps support the community that's underground as well, primarily because of some of the roots that form in these plants and the chemicals that come out of roots and the structure of those roots in that environment. So it's really a complex area of study. And to me, it's really fascinating to try to think about how to share that complexity with young people. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons why I'm really interested in getting kids excited about this is that in my area of professional study, the health of the soil is really an emerging issue in food production. So if you think about how you're trying to educate young people for a future career or the future of their food production, I think it's really wonderful to try to get young people interested in this idea of the soil being this living area of our world that we really need to treat with care and try to understand in order to help us live better lives. So a lot of things that we're trying to promote in our professional societies is trying to minimize disturbance of the soil. So we're not trying to move the soil as much when we're planting crops or harvesting crops, trying to make sure that we are covering our soils as much as possible with degrading or decomposing plant materials that were on that ground, or by the living plant materials. We're trying to maximize the biodiversity of our systems, so trying to plant lots of different types of crops, or make sure that the crops that we plant each year are different from each other to try to help support that soil community. And if we can at all possible do this, we're going to try to utilize plants in our systems that have roots that are always going to be alive below ground. So again, that we can support this living factory that is found in the soil. So soils really are full of life, and we can measure this in a lot of different ways. And so I think this is a pretty cute demonstration that the Natural Resource Conservation Service has on their website that really shows that in a healthy soil, there is a diverse, complex community of macroorganisms and microorganisms, and that they really have this, all these different functionalities that support a robust system. And we can measure this through many types of analytical tests and through a lot of physical property determinations of our soils. And that soils that don't have this complexity, that maybe aren't as healthy, it's really easy for us to see these in some of the physical attributes of the soils. And we'll try to talk about some demonstrations that we can show kids that can kind of illustrate this to younger people. As I mentioned, the soil really is this living factory, and it does support all parts of the food web. In our particular presentation today, I'm really going to focus primarily on studies that look at how when we influence organic matter in a soil, and how when we influence the plants in the soil, we can maybe influence some of these microorganisms like fungi, as well as some small macroorganisms like earthworms. So you could spend hours talking about all the wonderful services that soil provides to the whole food web. But really in these activities, we're going to primarily focus on kind of the lower chains of the food web in terms of the activities that we look at. One thing that I think is really interesting is that there have been a lot of studies about all the biodiversity in soils and how that really has an impact on the world. Soils were thought to be such a critical element of our global health that the Food and Agriculture Organization, this international organization that focuses on kind of rural development and food production, really did this by recognizing 2015 as this International Year of Soils. And so there are several activities you can find in the Food and Agriculture Organization website that helps us look at soils for activities with young people. And so soil really is home to a lot of to a lot of the planet's biodiversity. And many research projects and projects that we've done with some of our students really try to focus on that. We have a project that's happening here at the University of Wisconsin River Falls that is part of a national level project called Tiny Earth Project that really tries to think about how we can look into that biodiversity that's in the soil from a microbial level and maybe tap into that biodiversity to recognize the next new set of antibiotics or other medical applications that might come from things that we find in the soil. So Tiny Earth Project really is headquartered out of UW-Madison, but they interact with a lot of other undergraduate institutions and some K-12 institutions to try to allow students to sample soils in their area, and then take those soils into a lab and analyze them for different properties like antibiotic properties. And this is not just something that's meant for students to experiment with, but professional researchers have actually done this, and there have been several Nobel Prizes that have been awarded to researchers that have identified new medicinal components by what we call bioprospecting from the soil, meaning that we take this soil matrix, this soil mixture, and we look at it for these different types of microorganisms that might be in there, and we can isolate those microorganisms and use them for different types of purposes, right? Okay, so in this webinar, we're going to talk about some different types of activities, and I try to think about these activities as to how we're going to think about some different properties of soils, or the soil factory, how we can explore it. And so one of these aspects of the soil factory are physical components. So soil has some discrete physical properties that can be easily looked at with some different activities. So these include the properties of air that are found in soil, properties of water that are found in soils, and the water really plays a key role in how things are filtered through systems, so filtration, as well as the retention of water has a lot of consequences for people in their everyday lives. Also, the physical properties of soil involve the minerals that are in the soil, as well as the organic matter. And so again, we'll have some activities that kind of focus a lot on these kind of physical properties. These physical properties then interact with each other to help create some biological properties. So there are a lot of biological properties of this factory, including how this treatment of soil influences the biological diversity of the microorganisms that are in this soil. And we won't talk about microorganism tests per se, but we will talk about some tests that can be an estimation of that microbial activity that's happening in soils. This is also important for how we recycle nutrients. And so if we think about a lot of big picture issues like pollution and climate change, nutrient cycling plays a role in some of those things. And so although we won't talk about nutrient cycling in this webinar, it's a nice comparison to try to think about how this soil is managed right in our small area can have an impact on a bigger system, such as climate change or overall pollution in water systems. We also think about soils and some of the ecosystem services that they can provide. So these are going to be things that maybe aren't easy for us to measure, but again, we can talk about these from an applied setting to our students. So these include things like carbon cycling. So again, when we think about climate change and the movement of carbon in our atmosphere, the soils play an important role in capturing some of that carbon, but also in cycling that carbon through the microorganisms that live in that soil. And so we'll talk about a test for soil respiration, which again would kind of help us look at the biological property of soils that also has this ability to influence our overall ecosystem. The other really important thing about soils is that they play an important role in decomposition and nutrient cycling. So this is an important service that soils provide to our whole ecosystems. So for those of you that aren't familiar with some of the basic properties of soils, again, soils are a complex matrix that are comprised of both solids. So the solids we typically think of as the minerals and the organic matter. And then within this soil matrix are pores or holes in that soil, which can be made up of water and air at different percentages based on how that soil is managed and the type of soil that it is. And so one pretty neat activity that we can do with soils that looks at this idea of how much air does a soil hold is called soil bubbling, and we'll talk about that in a couple slides. But before we talk about the activity, I wanted to talk a little bit about where you might want to take soils from to help you show the greatest comparisons in some of the activities that you might do. So by choosing a soil that soils that have really big differences between each other, you'll be able to kind of show the greatest effect. So some areas to consider would be if you have an environment where you have some sloping topography, it might be interesting to pull soils that are maybe high up on a hillside in this topography, and also soils that are maybe in a valley or a lower area of that topography, because you'll see different properties of the soils likely. It's also fun to look at soils that have been disturbed versus undisturbed. So maybe this would be your garden bed, which is probably being disturbed all the time as you are growing new crops, versus a grassy area, which probably is not very disturbed because it likely has been in grass for several years. And you might see some interesting differences in the soils by pulling from those two different areas. It also is interesting to look at how the soil has been stepped upon, so to speak, or the traffic that's gone over the soil. So in a schoolyard, for instance, it might be interesting to look at areas that are near a playground where you get lots of traffic versus areas that might be near a fence line where there isn't going to be as much compaction or traffic from children running all over it. And so by choosing samples carefully, you can really have a stronger demonstration. And so I was mentioning one of the first activities is soil bubbling. And so we'll get to the next slide. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about one tool that you can use to try to identify different soil types if you want to get soils outside of your schoolyard, or maybe even understand soils that might be found in your schoolyard or at your location. So there is a free service that's provided by the United States Department of Agriculture, and they operate something called the Web Soil Survey. So the Web Soil Survey is an internet-based platform that allows you to determine the types of soil that might be on a piece of land. So it's very similar to like Google Maps or other web-based platforms that allow you to look at aerial imagery and try to determine something about it. So you can find your location by zip code or by using your address. And once you find your location, you can then put a perimeter around that location and ask this website to tell you the types of soils that are in your location through essentially a shopping cart, a soils shopping cart. And so this is just an example of a web soil survey query that we did for Troy Gardens, which is in Madison. And so it's just showing you that in this particular garden, there are several types of soils, and they're present to different degrees throughout the landscape. And so it might be fun to try to pull soils that you know have different types of characteristics to them. And so this can be a nice way to help introduce some technology, if you'd like to, into a soils activity with your students or with the children that you're working with, and then actually use this information to help you take samples that will provide the most meaning. So as I was mentioning, one of the first types of activities we can do, especially with soils that have different amounts of foot traffic or compaction on them, is to look at that air component in soils. And so because soils have pores in them that can either hold air or water, we can use a visualization to actually demonstrate how much water is in that soil. And so in order to do this, you first would need to have some soils that are broken into smaller sort of chunks. And then the soils you essentially spray with a liquid water solution on the outside of the solution for a small amount of time. You let that sit, and then you place those small chunks of soil into a cup of water. And essentially what will happen is whatever air is in that soil aggregate will basically come out in bubbles in the water. So it's kind of cool. It looks like bubbling champagne almost. And you will see differences in this bubbling of soils based on how compacted the soil is. So if you have a really high traffic area, you won't have as much of those air spaces open anymore, so you won't see as much bubbling. So it's a pretty cool activity to show students without a lot of equipment needed to do the activity. Another activity that's pretty common and is very visual and I think a lot of fun for people of all ages is it's essentially a way for us to look at the texture of the soil or the types of particles that make up a soil sample. Kidsgardening.com uses the term soil mud shakes a lot to describe what this is. But essentially what you do is to take a sample of soil, so maybe a cup or so of soil, place it into a container that you have a lid for, and then fill the rest of that container up with water and seal it, and you shake it, right? And as you're shaking it, you will see that all of the particles of this soil, the solids of this soil, will become dispersed in the water. And for those of you that aren't familiar with a lot of aspects of soils, the particles of soils are typically divided into three broad categories of sand, silt, and clay, and they're divided based on size. And so essentially what this activity does is by shaking up the particles into water and then letting them settle, so we're making this shake, and we're going to let it settle out, we can start to determine what amounts of these different particles might be in the soil sample. I thought it was pretty interesting. So the CGIAR is an international organization that focuses on agricultural research, and they have this kind of neat activity that they have published about where you can actually do a more tactile demonstration with children about what the different particles mean. And so, because sand particles are typically large, they're going to take up more space, like someone with their arms stretched out. Silt particles, which are a little bit smaller, are going to take up less room, but they still will take up more room than clay, which would be like a person with their hands at their sides. And this is important to try to think about how these different particle sizes influence how a soil is going to operate, because as you have these different size particles together in this complex system of soil, it's going to influence how things move, right? So if you had people standing in a room that had their arms out or their arms down, and you try to move in this space, you can see how movement can be affected based on the size that something is taking up. So I did want to mention that Kids Gardening does have some great activities for soil. In fact, they published a whole booklet on soils activities called Digging into Soil. And this is where I got some of the specifics for the soil mud shake activity from. And so I would encourage you to go to their website and look at this document, because it has, again, a lot of activities that can be done for different age levels. So the soil mud shake test, as I mentioned, can be done at a more analytical level in a laboratory. And when it's done in a laboratory, in addition to dispersing the particles and letting them settle, we typically will measure the amount of particles that are in these different size fractions. And so the size fractions of these particles will fall out of solution at different rates in time, and then will deposit themselves at different layers because of their size. So the larger sand particles will typically settle to the bottom. The slightly smaller silt particles will be in the middle, and the very small clay particles will finally settle to the top. And so you'll see this happening to some degree pretty quickly as the test is going on, or as you're doing this activity. But as you let the solution sit for about a day unsettled, so this is showing you, the picture on the left is showing you a jar where the shake test had been settled out for about a day. You can start to really clearly see these layers. And if you really wanted to take this to a quantitative level, you can actually measure this with a ruler, right? So you could use a ruler on the side of this container and measure the depths of these different layers. You could use those depths in a calculation to create a percentage. And then if you wanted to take this into a more advanced audience, you can then approximate maybe what type of soil this might be by looking at those different percentages. And this can be really, really a cool way to study soils, because now you've maybe done this test at your school with this kind of mud shake test. You've created a way to measure the different types of particles in the soil. You can use this soil texture triangle to try to determine the type of soil. And then you could even go back to the Web Soil Survey and confirm whether or not you were really close with the analysis that you did in your classroom. So this is definitely an activity that you can take to many levels of school. It doesn't have to be just for an elementary education level. You could take this all the way up to high school level or beyond. So it's a pretty fun activity, depending on how you want to utilize it. And so again, this is an activity, the soil mud shake test is something that tells us about the texture of the soil. So what is the distribution of the different size particles of the solids in these soils? Another kind of interesting test that can be done is to look at kind of the infiltration of soils, or how water moves through a soil. So this is commonly done in a professional setting through what's called a perk test. So perk tests are really important in our everyday lives because they help us determine how water is going to drain through a system, and especially is important for things like septic system development. But in the case of a school activity, we can kind of estimate this idea of perk by taking a soil sample, sitting it inside of a coffee filter, and then pouring a known amount of water through this filter. And so this can be easily done with like a 2-liter bottle, cutting it so that the top of the bottle creates a funnel, using that funnel to place your coffee filter inside of, and then putting your aggregate of soil or your soil sample inside of it and seeing how water flows. So how quickly that water flows is typically a function of how much living material was in that soil at one time, and also those types of particles or the texture that's in the soil. So again, if you had different types of soils, you could kind of demonstrate how the water movement through these soils is going to be different and apply that to different situations, like how maybe water will move to other bodies of water outside of your school, or how that water might influence what things go with the water as it's moving. So it's a pretty universal test that can have a lot of applications. We can also carry on with this idea of how water moves with soil and the fact that there are different particles and organisms in soil that serve as filters in the soil. So this is an activity that was kind of crafted through the Soil Science Society of America. And so what's kind of unique about soils is not only do these particles and organic matter influence how liquid is going to move, but there also can be chemical reactions that occur. And so Kool-Aid, especially grape Kool-Aid, carries some certain chemical properties to it. And so if we pour this grape Kool-Aid over a soil filter, so essentially what I mean by a soil filter is we could use a coffee filter, or we could use a cup with some perforations in it that has our soil sample in it. If we pour a liquid solution of Kool-Aid over this soil, we will find that the purple Kool-Aid that we poured in many cases does not come back out as purple. It comes back out as something else. And that is because the soil particles have some chemical reaction, right? Because some of these particles are negatively charged. And so because this clay in this case has a negative charge to it, that's going to have a different type of reaction with the red dye that's in the grape Kool-Aid. So essentially what happens is because the red dye has the same type of charge as clay, it's going to pass through the soil and not react with the clay, while the blue dye, because it has a positive charge, which is different than the soil particle, is going to be retained by the soil. So you can kind of look at different types of soil samples and how they have different aspects of filtering things out of the soil. This can be really important to talk to students about how when we pour things onto our soil, so maybe things that we think are pollution, like gasoline or oil or maybe fertilizers in some cases, that the soil, because water is moving through it and there's something in that water that's moving through it, that some of those potential pollutants can get trapped by the soil. So soil has a really important function in our ecosystem to filter out some of these negative chemicals that we might be using. Another cool test that can be done that looks at some physical properties of soils is sometimes called the soil glue test. And so soils, particularly soils that have a lot of organic matter in them, have properties where they can be very, they have a strong aggregation together. And so how this test is performed is by taking some hardwire cloth or hardware cloth, cutting it into or hardwire mesh and making it into a little bowl. You can place this bowl on top of some clear containers. So this could be a mason jar, or it could be a vase or something like that. The taller the container is, sometimes this demonstration works out better. So you basically will make a little basket that has that's made out of this wire so that it has some mesh properties for the soil particles to come through. And as you lightly place this soil aggregate onto the water that's in the basket into the water, the properties of the soil will hold the soil together based on how stable what we call the aggregate is. And so this is a property, as I mentioned, of organic matter. And so typically if there's more organic matter, you'll see that the soil will be more stable. It has a stronger aggregate stability to it. And so it will not fall apart as easily into the water, as if you have a soil that maybe has less organic matter or less material in it, and it's going to be more likely to break apart more easily. And so I think to students, it kind of shows some of the fragility of soils, and that, if we treat soils differently, or if soils have different properties, that's going to influence how well the soil kind of glues together or adheres together. And this can have really important applications, because this can influence how soils might erode more easily than other soils, how they might move different places more easily than others because of how they're treated or some of their inherent properties. So again, soil glue is a measurement of some of the organic matter that might be in the soils, primarily because there are some fungi that live in the soil. And these fungi they produce a substance called glomalin, which is really important for kind of holding the soil together. So that's kind of the soil glue in many cases is produced by these fungi that can live in soils. This is not necessarily a test that you can do with soils, but I did just want to mention that soils can be used in very creative aspects. So there are several artists that you can find that actually make works of art strictly out of different types of soils. And so because soils have different mineral composition, those minerals can result in different pigmentations that create different types of paints essentially. And so soil as a work of art is not something new. It's been done for, thousands of years, right? But there are some really great examples right now of modern artists that do these paintings that are made, strictly out of soils. And in your setting, your paintings might not look like this with the artists that you are dealing with, but you can still have a lot of fun with soils. So you can purchase different types of soil painting kits through some different educational venues online that have different soil samples that have different mineral compositions to them that allow you to have a different spectrum of colors. But you can make these on site as well by taking soil and drying it and then pulverizing it. And then once you pulverize that soil or powder that soil, you can use it just as it is by diluting it with a little bit of water. But also if you add a small amount of glue to it, that will allow the soil to adhere to paper more easily. And so you'll have more of a durable art project if you add a small amount of glue or some other adhesive or polymer to it to allow it to adhere. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the physical components of the factory. I also wanted to move on to talk about some of the biological components and the ecosystem services and some of the activities that we can do related to those. So when I think about this with my college level students, I think a lot about how, because the soil is this living factory and we treat it in many different ways in our environment, particularly in the area of study that I'm in, where we're growing things like corn and soybeans, how we treat that soil can have a really big impact on our environment in terms of what's moving from our place of residence or our place of work or our place of school to some other location like a river or a lake. And so there are some great activities that demonstrate that how we treat our soil can influence what's moving across the surface of our soil and also through our soil. So the Natural Resource Conservation Service has been really good at creating these kind of rainfall simulator activities. And so these things cost several $1,000s to make. So they're not necessarily meant for the audience that many schools will be dealing with, but they demonstrate some of the cool properties of things that we can do with a lot smaller budget. So what's kind of unique about these systems is they have pans in them. So these pans can be filled with different types of soils. So at a schoolyard, maybe this would be, the turf grass that's on the soccer field and the turf grass that's near the playground. And maybe this would be the mulched area that's on the playground. And maybe some of these would be the garden beds that are on the schoolyard. And so by taking these pans of material that have little perforations in the bottom, and applying water to the top. So this has an irrigated system in this professional demonstration unit here, but we can apply water to the top of the system, and we can look at two kinds of aspects of how water and soil particles can move. So one aspect is this kind of runoff that you're going to see, or surface movement of water and particles, and that's going to really be changing by the type of material that's on the surface of this soil. Right, so as we have more living materials on the soil surface versus nothing living on the soil surface, that's really going to change how water and particles move off the system. And you can see that in a really actively growing, biologically active system, that there really is not going to be anything that comes off the surface of the soil when we have water moving it. Then we also, through the perforations in these pans, can look at what's going to come below. So what's going to infiltrate and move through this soil. And that's what's demonstrated on these buckets down here, is what type of water is moving through the soil and what that water looks like. And again, you can see that in some examples, this example is pretty neat here, because what this is showing is that almost all the water and particles basically move off the soil, and nothing really makes it into the soil at all. Those are rocks just to hold the bucket down, because nothing really infiltrated or went through the soil system. But in other systems, like this really healthy green active system, we won't get much that comes off the surface at all. So this bucket basically has some rocks in it to hold it down because it's empty of water. We will see that the water basically gets moved through the system, right? And that the amount of soil that's moving with this water is different as well because of how the soil's been treated or managed. So we can't necessarily do this system with the budget that we have at a school, but it's pretty easy to set up these systems if you have some containers. So if you have some jugs or things like that from your school cafeteria, you can create a system like this, or even just having like catering pans or things like that. Those aluminum trays can work well for this. And you can either plant things in this, so you could do the planting yourself to look at how different plants will influence how water moves through and over a soil. Or you can go outside and dig up a sample for yourself. This system actually has some irrigation with it, but you wouldn't need irrigation. You could just use a watering can or some sort of jug system to apply the water to the system. And then you can recycle other containers. Like you can see here, they recycled some soda containers here to collect the water that's basically moving through the system. And you can see in this particular activity how when we don't have a lot of material living on the soil, that this influences the amount of water and also what's in that water and how it moves off the system. And here, this maybe is trying to demonstrate like a forest environment, how we have some leaf cover on the soil and how that may influence what the water looks like as it's moving through it. So it's a pretty fun demonstration that kind of looks at how we cover our land, how we cover our ground, influences how water runs off that ground and how water moves through that ground. So it can be a really cool demonstration. And you can apply this to some really advanced audiences where you could actually measure the water, measure the material that's in that water. So it's got a lot of applicability across audiences. Another thing that's kind of gained a lot of attention in my area of study, not necessarily because of, well, it does something pretty cool, but it also gained a lot of attention because it has a really cool name, which is called Soil Your Undies. And so this has been a challenge that has been promoted heavily by the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It's done in Canada, so it's being promoted by their Council of Agriculture in Canada. And this is an activity that helps us look at how things decompose in the soil. So essentially what this activity is you take some underwear, and they should be primarily cotton underwear because you're looking at the decomposition of some organic material. So you need cotton because it's organic, as opposed to maybe some other materials that are more synthetic materials. And essentially what you take and do is you take your underwear and bury them in the ground for a series of times. So it could be, a month and a half or 2 months or maybe a whole summer long. And then you unbury them and look at how different types of treatment of the land influences how this cotton basically, or this natural fiber, is going to decompose. So this is kind of a neat activity. So you take the underwear, you bury them. They don't have to bury them very deeply. And ideally you actually want to leave a little bit exposed so that you can find the underwear later on. So you can bury it for a couple months, bury it kind of shallowly, and then you'll take the underwear and bring them back out of the ground after the end of the time, and compare how different types of environments might influence decomposition. So I could see this being done at a school where you maybe have a forested area and you want to see how maybe a forest soil is going to help decomposition rates different than maybe an area in your school garden or something like that. And it's pretty fun. And there are a lot of cool videos online if you want to show them to your students about people doing the Soil Your Undies challenge. And they a lot of farmers basically show the audience what their decomposed underwear looks like. And so it does really work best with cotton underwear, again, because even this elastic waistband on the underwear won't decompose at the same rate because it's, again, not a natural fiber. So another thing that we can test is decomposition rates of different materials besides underwear. So there's a cool test called the Teabag Test, which also is a measurement of decomposition. And so this was a test that was being promoted heavily in Europe. And I know some students that have done this test in the United States. And so essentially what you do is you take 2 types of tea bags. You take red tea and you take green tea. And the reason why you want to use these 2 different types of tea, red tea and green tea, is because they have gone through a different fermentation process. And so they represent different levels of decomposition before you actually put them in the ground. And so what you're trying to measure with this test is how much loss of the tea contents is going to occur when they're in the soil. So as the tea starts to decompose in the soil, it will lose weight. The tea bag will lose weight, and so you would just weigh these tea bags once you've placed them in the ground. And so there are great instructions on how to do this activity at the Tea Time for Science website, and so they have some great protocols for how to do this. But essentially, it's a burying of these 2 types of tea bags. And then when they're done being buried, you weigh them to see how much tea has been lost. And really this helps you think about how decomposition is a part of the carbon cycle, right? So it's the organic material in these tea bags that's decomposing. And because soils help with this cycling process, that cycling of these materials can really influence the climate because they're cycling carbon. Right. And as I was mentioning, it's good to have both types of tea because the red tea is, because it's already started some of the decomposition process, it's going to degrade a little more slowly than the green tea. So it's good to have those 2 teas to kind of compare how rates of decomposition are going to be different for different types of materials. Another kind of cool test that helps us look at the biology of soils is to think about whether soils breathe or not. And so what I mean by breathing is that they are going to release gases based on the biological activity that's occurring in them. And so this is a test that you can actually purchase online called the Sativa test. And so the Sativa test looks for the carbon dioxide that's released by soils as they are respiring or breathing. And so the Sativa test has a really nice scale for marking the different levels of CO2 or carbon dioxide that are released from the soil. And it's pretty easy for this test to be done. Essentially what you do is you take a soil sample, you put this basically sensor inside of your soil sample, cap it off, and then you remove the cap after the test is done and compare the color of your sensor to the color on the chart. And that gives you an indication of amounts of CO2. This can be really fun to do in a composting system. So these tests are sometimes sold for people who want to test their compost to look at the biological activity of their compost, but it can be done in a soil sample as well. One of the limitations of this test is that it's not really cheap. It takes about $100 to purchase 4 of these tests. So it's not necessarily going to be an activity that all audiences can do. And really, as I mentioned, this is a test. As we're measuring carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide is really coming out of the soil because of biological activity. And so that is basically helping us show to students that soils really are living, and that just like how we are living and breathing every day, so are the microbes that live in the soil. We can do this from a more analytical, or not analytical, but use chemistry to help us do this same type of test without purchasing a kit. So this is an activity that was developed and published on the Carleton College website. And so this activity utilizes the principles of a lime water, so a heavily saturated lime water. And so lime water, when it is prepared, the saturated solution of lime and water is clear naturally, but as it interacts with carbon dioxide, it starts to turn the water from clear to cloudy. So you can take different soil samples, and in this enclosed environment, so this is going to be a sealed up container with a with a tube that's going to have no air leaks ideally, and it's going to go directly be submerged in this lime water. And same thing here. As you let this soil sit over time, the gas or CO2 that's released from this soil is going to be pushed through this tube into the solution. And as it reaches the solution, if there's a lot of CO2, it will turn the solution from clear to white. And so basically, the more white the solution is, the more biological activity you have, right? So again, this is a closed system to measure soil respiration, right? The breathing and biological activity of the soil. And that the reason why it works is because when the carbon dioxide reacts with this lime water, it creates a white substance or white precipitate. So this might not be for really elementary audiences, but definitely could be applied to middle school and high school science classes. And so essentially, the more soil life you have, the more respiration you have occurring, you would see more precipitate or more white in the solution. All right. So one thing that I've been kind of interested in at our university is how we manage our soils influences some macroscopic organisms in the soil environment. And so we have been suggested, or it's been suggested by some farmers in our area that they notice that there are more earthworms in soils that they don't disturb. And so this got me thinking about how this could be used as a cool activity for soils in a school garden. So it is fairly easy to try to track earthworms, and there's a great website that's based out of University of Minnesota Duluth called the Great Lakes Worm Watch, and they have great protocols on how you can kind of hunt for earthworms. And so essentially what you're doing is you're going to utilize a mustard extraction. So basically it's about 40 grams of like that powdered dry yellow mustard powder that you use for as a spice in your cooking. You take about 40 grams of that and put it in to about a gallon of water, a liter of water. And so you just basically pour this solution over the soil. And if you have the right conditions, typically cool soils and moist soils, that mustard solution will cause the earthworms at the surface to come out of the soil. And then you can count those earthworms. So the idea is that the mustard solution kind of irritates the worms, and that's why they leave the solution or leave the soil, but it is a kind of a neat activity to do. And as we know, earthworms have this really important impact on the environment in that they're used for cycling the materials, the organic materials that are in the environment. And so how we manage our land, if it influences earthworms, then those earthworms in turn are influencing the land. And so it's kind of interesting to see how there's this cascading effect of how we manage the land influences earthworms, and those earthworms influence the land itself. So to me, it's kind of cool to look at that cycle. So this is a pretty easy activity to do as long as you have access to some of this mustard powder, which most people can buy at the grocery store. And as I mentioned, this is kind of neat because at your school or at your location, you could look at how a garden setting, how you've disturbed that soil, or maybe how you've added compost or other things, how that's influencing earthworm activity compared to maybe the grassy lawn that's next to it. Okay. The one thing I would mention again, though, this is really dependent on soil moisture and temperature. So it's not an activity that's going to be very successful in really hot days during the summer when it's been really dry, because the earthworms will not be close enough to the surface for this mustard extraction to really bring them out to be visible to the students. The last thing I'll finish up with is that something that you can do all year round is to look at how the cycling properties of soils can occur with a high organic matter environment that we find in composting. So vermicomposting is a really cool system that can be tried on many different levels. This system here is a purchase system called the Hot Frog composting unit. It runs, I think, for about $120. But you can also create these systems pretty easily by taking containers and making perforations in them that allow movement of air, but don't allow the worms to escape. And so this system's kind of fun because it really helps our young people think about how the food that they eat, that material that's left over, those food scraps, how they really are materials that can be recycled to create soil to grow the next crop of food. And so to me, it's really a great activity to look at kind of the cycling of these elements for children. So with that, I would just like to leave you with some websites for your information that you may find useful to find other soils activities. So as I mentioned, kidsgardening.org is a great reference where they have this digging into soil curriculum. Also, Soils for Teachers, which is operated by the Soil Science Society of America, also has a lot of information. The Natural Resource Conservation Service is also full of lots of information for all ages audiences, so young people all the way up to professionals. The Great Lakes Worm Watch, as I mentioned, is a great place for information on how to hunt for earthworms, or how to use the mustard extraction procedure for looking at worms. They also have information on how you can become part of a citizen science project if you want to do that with earthworms. And then the Food and Agriculture Organization is an international organization that also has a lot of information on soils activities. So with that, I thank you so much for participating in this webinar. And I know that we have a few minutes for questions if anyone is still able to join us. So thank you.
Thank you, Veronica. We do have a question. Carmen asked, when you were talking about the soil, when you were showing those filtration systems with like the one that you can make out of the jugs in the classroom, I believe it was around those slides. Jeff, how do these minerals transfer to vegetables?
Oh, yes, that's a, and that can be pretty complex. So, you know, the majority of the minerals that plants are going to take up from the soil, they're going to take in through their roots. And so you can do a whole series of activities thinking about how roots, or how the plumbing system of a plant allows it to take things up. So, yeah, so I hope that answered that question. A great activity that can help demonstrate that is by using things like carnations or celery and placing them in different colored solutions of water. And that really demonstrates that there's, you know, a really complex plumbing system in plants that allows them to extract things like minerals out of the soil.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, if there are any other questions, I have been putting some links as Professor was talking. I put in some links to the hot frog compost, as well as I found the curriculum from kidsgardening.org, and I put that in there, along with a link to the Soil Your Undies, because that's so fun. But if there are no other questions, I want to thank everybody for their time, and thank you for joining us again. I'll be emailing out probably next week the link to the webinar if you'd like to get some of those links, or review some resources and other things like that. So thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.